Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And on this podcast, my goal is to help you become a better fantasy writer. Whether you're just starting out, you're a beginner maybe, or maybe you're like me, you're a barbarian, and there are no skill levels that can define you. You are just out there pounding paper with pen and sword. I don't know how this metaphor is really shaking out as I'm saying it, but there you go. All right, so we're back to our regularly scheduled programming. Yeah, we did a video yesterday, but today we're doing an audio only, and I'm hoping this is going to be a good one. I have a backlog of prompts to get through, and I'm excited to keep going with it. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. Glad you're here. And, here's the format, so you know what we're doing. I always take a look, or I shouldn't say always. I usually take a look at a prompt, either from a listener or from the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. And I react to the prompt live on air. I'm reading it for the first time right now. Our wonderful producer, Natalia Emmons, finds these prompts for us and helps program the show. And then at the end, we have our resident fact checker, producer Bridget Surdock, who is just going to listen back to the tape and make sure I didn't make any egregious errors. And also we can add some clarifications on anything I missed. So without further ado, let's look at today's prompt. Okay, so this does come to us from the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com and username CHLOAE221. I guess Chloe, we're going to say Chloe. So this is Chloe's prompt. Chloe writes, how long is too long? So I'm currently writing the second chapter in my epic fantasy novel. There's multiple point of views, a plethora of topics and main characters, and a large, expansive world. Chapter 1 was around 3,500 words, but Chapter 2 is already at 7,000. And I don't think I'm even close to finishing all the things I want to tackle before Chapter 3. Basically, is a long chapter a turnoff? Or is it okay as long as the content in the chapter is exciting/engaging? Me personally, I can't recall a chapter being too long unless it's of something with multiple POVs, such as Malazan. But I just wanted some other thoughts on how y'all think chapters should be split up. So there are a bunch of comments on this. Before I look at any of the comments, though, we're going to just kind of react ourselves here. And so, yeah, I think that when it comes to chapters, I've talked a little bit about this. I don't sweat chapter length as much as a lot of people, and I just personally believe length of chapter is nowhere near as important as the length of a scene. And if you have a very long chapter, I would have a lot of questions because it can be fine, as this person is saying, oh, maybe the content is fine, 7,000 words, no big deal. But it could mean that 7,000 words, it being that long, is a sign of maybe some structural issues or issues with your scene. So let's go through it. And I do think that there are some people who take the extreme of this, who say that, oh, chapter length doesn't matter at all. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that you can have a chapter that maybe doesn't have like a reasonable place to stop or for the reader to stop. And you might be like, oh, well, why would the reader want to stop? I'm writing a page turner over here. Well, I hear you on that. But the thing is, most readers, they do need to stop for whatever reason, or sometimes you want to take a break to process. Not everybody wants to read an entire book in just a day or two, almost in one sitting. What they want to do is they want to experience your book, come back to it, and feel enraptured in it. And so when those section breaks do come, they do keep going and they feel like, one more chapter. So that's a good reason why it's helpful to keep chapter length as consistent as possible. I think for me, the exception where I tend to make my chapters a little bit longer than I probably should are my first and last chapters, mainly because I really think chapter 1 should end on a really good hook. And it seems like this person is dealing with the opposite problem, where their first chapter, pretty normal length, 3,500 words, that's pretty good. That's a sign that first chapter is pretty tight. But the second chapter being that long, that could definitely raise some red flags for folks. So think of some books that you might like. I think A Song of Ice and Fire, those books, the Game of Thrones books, those chapters tend to be all over the place in terms of length. Sometimes they're extremely long and frustratingly so. Wheel of Time tends to have some really long chapters. Think The Shadow Rising in particular. And I would also say The Poppy War has a very long first chapter, but I would argue the first chapter of that book is kind of the best part of the book, in my opinion. So all that said, I think that chapter length a lot of the time doesn't matter nearly as much as the scenes themselves. And I think that if you want to get for that sweet spot for your chapter length, focus instead on the scene. Readers typically don't put books down thinking, "Oh, that chapter was too long." They usually put it down saying like, that scene dragged. It went on a little bit too long, or it was more about the content kind of being too dragged out. I think that especially in a fantasy novel, an epic fantasy novel, you really need compelling scenes to chain together, and each scene needs to have a clear turning point. I say this all the time. If you can write good scenes, you can write a good short story. If you can write a good short story, you can write a good novel. It's all about that sequence of events. I think that if your chapter is full of 7,000 words, but it is filled with a lot of distinct and engaging scenes, then it won't feel long necessarily. However, if it's 7,000 words of setup without movement, without any sense of forward motion, then yes, your reader is definitely going to feel the drag. And you have to ask yourself a few questions. In fact, instead of asking yourself, oh, is this chapter too long? Ask yourself this: does this chapter contain multiple scenes? Does each scene change something in terms of character motivation, stakes, or the reader's understanding? Does it change any of these things? And lastly, could this chapter be broken into smaller self-contained scenes without losing impact? So those are really the questions I would personally focus on more. And you might be thinking, okay, but what if readers themselves tend to bounce off long chapters? And on one hand, readers can love a long chapter, especially in epic fantasy. If you're writing something with a Malazan-esque scope, then long chapters are kind of expected. Typically, it's almost a genre convention, honestly. And readers do expect to marinate in this world that you are building for them. But here is the catch: you have to earn that length. You really need to look at your pacing. Readers will follow you anywhere if you reward them for their time. The trick is to keep them hooked with things like cliffhangers, microtension, the sense that something's always shifting, even in a slower scene. That's how you keep people on the pages and not dipping out because they feel like nothing's happening. But if your chapter is long, especially that second chapter, because you are trying to cram all the setup, as they say before chapter 3, before moving forward, that could be a structural problem. I don't know exactly what your chapter 2 is like. I'm just kind of going off of what you said, but assuming that it's set up for chapter 3 and that's why you can't move on, then yes, that can be a structural problem, not necessarily a length problem. I know we have a whole episode about outlining and how if you're going by Michael Haig's 6-act story structure, then you can break these things down to, all right, what's the percentage? How long does it take to get to the inciting incident as a percentage of the word count of the novel that I'm expecting? That's not required. That's kind of an optional thing. A lot of people don't like to be put into that box, mind you, but it can help you save a lot of time and a lot of effort in terms of revisions. So let's say you do finish the novel and you get back to it months later and you're trying to revise it and you realize this book is starting in the wrong place. The inciting incident is 10 chapters in when it should be in the second chapter, things like that. You can save yourself some time ahead of time if you try to organize your thoughts and plans around a structure that makes sense for the reader and benefits them above your own predispositions. But okay, I do want to read the comments, but I do want to also talk about how you can maybe break up a long chapter if you need to, because that can happen too. I think that if you have a long chapter, sometimes it's hard to decide if you want to split the chapter up into chunks. Sometimes I pain over this decision on where to end a chapter. But if you do decide that the chapter itself is feeling kind of bloated, then one thing you can try to do is you can try to end the scene at a moment of intrigue. Maybe it's a little bit earlier than you planned for. And readers will keep going if you do this. I think, we've talked about Brandon Sanderson's Promise, Progress, and Payoff a bunch. And this applies here for sure. Every scene should feel like it's either setting up something, promising something, delivering something, or twisting something. If a chapter break feels natural at any of those points, then feel free to use it. It's a good place to maybe go for that chapter break or a section break that makes you feel like, okay, the scene's ending. And yeah, lastly, I'd say don't overthink it if you can. I think sometimes we typically overthink chapter length. I have a wonderful beta reader who certainly has gotten not mad at me, but has definitely been like, I wish some of your chapters would be a little bit shorter. She's told me straight up like she's asked me to like split entire chapters in half, but I struggle with this myself, and sometimes I think that in fantasy, I typically do a bit longer than I need to, but I think that, okay, if a chapter is getting to like 10,000 words, that's definitely like, okay, maybe you need to reevaluate. I certainly take a look and I'm like, all right, if it's at 6,000 words, that's typically the highest end that I have. And I have to earn those 6,000 words. Like, I really have to tighten it up. And you can always go back and you can try to shorten things without removing content, but maybe little things of like, okay, maybe we don't need all this interiority. Maybe we can cut out some of this exposition here, move it to another chapter. If you feel like it's not the scene itself, but it's just all the trappings around the scene that you can fix, then you can go for that too. You can bring a chapter that's 7,000 words down to maybe 4 or 5,000, and that's going to feel a little bit better for you and the reader. So you can do that and have your cake, eat it too, all that good stuff. Okay, now let's look at some of the comments. We have a comment here from J8M Field, and they write, "It really doesn't matter." I disagree. It can matter. That's the thing. I think that's a bit too absolutist. They write, "I've seen authors do a single paragraph and call it a chapter, and I've seen 20,000 words per chapter. You do whatever you like that you feel will serve your story. I'm currently writing my novel, and I average about 3,000 words per chapter, though some are 4,000, 5,000, or even more potentially. You do what you have to do. If the scene begs to be fleshed out further, you go do that. Snapping a chapter close prematurely may do a disservice to the scene just as much as dragging it on might." Yeah, I'm just going to have to say I don't agree. I think that, like, look, I agree with this person in the sense that we have similar writing styles. Like, as they say, like, my chapters typically around 3,000 words, and they can creep up to 4 or 5,000 sometimes, but not all the time. But this idea that it's all about how you feel, I get that. That's a nice thought to have of like empowering yourself. And I think that that's valid. However, you have to think about the reader too. And I don't like a lot of this prevailing advice that tends to come out of these forums and such, where it's very vibes based, honestly. And it's, do what you feel like, and people are going to, snap up and pay attention. Look, readers are fickle. If you want to sell a book, if you want to get a book out there, this is kind of what you have to contend with. You have to write a book that services the reader. There's a little bit of a customer service mentality to writing books that I think some authors don't like to reckon with because they think of it so much as like a tortured genius kind of thing. And I think that sometimes as writers, I've fallen into this too. Sometimes we need to get over ourselves and understand that we are trying to bring a world to a person, and it is okay to question and reevaluate how your writing is coming across in this way. And this idea that, like, if you feel 20,000 words is enough, well, how do you know that you are feeling the right thing? You might be way off, Sometimes and I don't say this as to be like, don't listen to your feelings on these things. I think that your feelings should be taken into account alongside of how you feel the book is best among other readers. And that's how beta readers can help you too. I do think that sometimes beta readers will give you advice that you just don't agree with, and you have to discern those things as we talk about on this show. But for the most part, I think that when it comes to you having to make these gut calls, I would say don't over rely on your instincts. Be curious, be open minded and skeptical of your feelings. Because sometimes the way we feel about a book, maybe if you come back to it 6 years later, you can be like, what was I thinking? I can't believe I thought that this chapter was working. Sometimes you can't really trust your own because you're so close to it. That's the thing. To you, a chapter that's 20,000 words or whatever, it might seem okay, but you're close to it. You know this world, it's coming to you in a certain way that it's not going to come to the reader. You need to be careful not to fall into that trap. We have another comment here from Torneil91, and they write, "I would hugely recommend splitting the chapter. You don't have to fully wrap up the chapter arc. Better to just split it at some point or some sort of transitional moment. 7,000 words is like 28 pages. That's a ton." Yeah, I'd say that this can be valid advice. Sometimes this is the right call. Sometimes it's not. And, I think this person, like me, is just sort of guessing at how your book might be set up and what might call for it better. But hopefully the person who posted this, Chloe, hopefully they're receiving this as like, okay, here are my options. I could split it up. I could be like, no, you know what, 7,000 words is right. It really depends on, them sharing that chapter out, or maybe self-critiquing that chapter with a little bit of honesty and going from there. Because I would say that, yeah, 7,000 words is a lot. But sometimes a chapter does need to be 7,000 words if that's what it needs to be. Sometimes it really doesn't. I think splitting it in two, it's not that hard in terms of if it's like into the novel, like if you're on chapter 2, 3, 4. I think sometimes it can be a little bit easier to split it because you can find those moments of intrigue. Like I was saying before, be like, yeah, this is a natural stopping point. I think where it can be tricky is the POV stuff. I think that they said that it was a POV thing. And I have a feeling, now that I'm thinking about it, actually, I have a feeling the reason the chapter 2 has to be so long is because they have a POV chapter that has to end at a certain point in the story for the next POV to start. And this is why writing multiple POVs is very, very hard when you are a first-time author. I don't know if this person's first-time author, but I don't remember if they said that. But assuming they are, yeah, this is why writing multiple POV could be really tough because you are putting very tough constraints on yourself in terms of how you can structure a novel. Now, I've talked about before how sometimes constraints are the best things you can do for yourself as an author. It can actually enable a lot of creativity on your part. So I'm not saying that to scare you or to say like, don't do this, However, you just have to accept like, okay, yeah, I have a very unique challenge here that a single POV kind of novel wouldn't have, and that's okay because you can learn through it and kind of figure out how to do things. You have to be creative about this. If this is the case, and I'm right that it's because a POV shift can't happen yet, and you maybe don't want to have two POV chapters that are consecutive, that could also be another thing. Another method, and aside from also cutting down your word count more aesthetically, another thing you can do is section breaks. You can use those as well, and they won't feel quite as bad in that scenario. So it's a tricky problem if that's what we're talking about. Opia Lavares writes, Stephen King writes long A chapters. Yeah, but you're not Stephen King. I don't like this. I don't like how it's like, well, this person does this person does. Yeah, I can give you 20 examples to counter that. I think using examples in this way is, I've talked about this before. You are giving examples of people who got away with it, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean you get away with. And again, I think that it's one of those things where it's almost like you're using examples to justify something that might not be right. And I don't like that. I just want to know if if it's right for this author. I don't care if it's right for Stephen King. Stephen King can write long chapters because he's been writing for 50 years and he's like, a celebrated author. He can get away with it. That's kind of his bag. That is irrelevant to whether or not you can get away with it. So I'm sorry, that bugs me. I really don't like that. I feel as though wherever is a good stopping point for you. No. See, this vibes focus thing is like, however you feel about it, man. Like, come on. Like, be a little bit more, like, as writers, be more curious, be more skeptical, be more open-minded, question how you feel about something. That's healthy, right? I think that sometimes this stuff can be so like, do whatever is right for you. That's not advice. That's not even therapy. That is just something else. Then from your stopping point, you should start the third chapter and so forth. You're a writer. You're allowed to expand yourself on your work. You're allowed to expand yourself, but that's not really the question, is it? The question is, if you expand your work and you do it incorrectly, are other people going to respond to it in a way that you don't want, right? I assume that they're writing this because they want it to be published. They want people to read this and enjoy this. And if you go into this with this mindset of like, I'm going to do what I want and people don't like it, who cares? That's the way I want to do it. Then you are setting yourself up for failure, quite frankly, because the vast majority of people with that mindset are just going to fail. Because if you don't have empathy for your reader and you don't really want to put yourself in their shoes, you are going to, unfortunately, in many cases, write trash. That is just the case. So yes, you want to be true to yourself and your feelings, but you want to question those feelings. You want those feelings to evolve based on how you think people will receive your novel. It's a balance. You can't go too much on the other side of it. You can't be totally beholden to the readers and be like, it's all about them. I can't do anything without asking my readers first. Like, you don't want to go that far, obviously. But it is a balance. It's nuance. It's complicated. And I don't like this oversimplification where it's like, don't even care about the readers, blah, blah, blah. But if you're wondering where to split it up if possible. Every 2,000 words, I'd stop and start a new chapter and or add my extra content to the chapter. Next chapter, only because I do everything in even numbers, but my point still stands if I'm making sense. You are not. Like, that's so arbitrary. Yeah, please do not listen to this person. That is so arbitrary. It's like every 2,000 words, like sometimes a scene does not, no. Do not listen to this person. I think that Having arbitrary stopping points like that feels really weird. I don't like it when I read books, and I bring this up if I beta read, that I feel like they end too early, or they just end in the middle of a scene, and it's like, why are we ending here? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you want to actually guide a reader along an experience, and you want that experience to be very nurtured and cultivated. I think a very understated sort of element of writing is like what makes somebody a good event planner. And that is being true to your vision if you're setting up an event, but also taking into account how people are going to experience the event. That includes the venue, where people are going to park, what people are going to eat at one time. There being an itinerary, you planning for all the contingencies and logistics. Event planning and learning the basics of that really, really helps you as an author, because as an author, it's the same kind of principle behind filmmaking. Filmmaking, so much of it comes down to the logistics. How are you able to actually shoot this thing on film, get everybody in one place at this perfect time, shoot it, make sure everybody has their lines, make sure the script is airtight. Like, it's a lot of planning and preparation. And sometimes I think writers who are just starting out really undervalue that kind of thing. Or they think that, like, I'm just going to sit in front of a computer and wing it and not really take these things into account. And that could be fine if you are just kind of expressing yourself creatively, artistically, as a passion. And in fact, I think that's a really fun thing that you can do. However, if you are in this and you are reaching out to other people, that tells me it's because you want this to be great. You want other people to read it and to experience your story through their own eyes, but also through your eyes too. And that is a very difficult thing to do. And this is just one of many things you can do to set yourself up for that kind of success that I think that you want. Okay, I think that's enough comments. There are a bunch more, but they're probably going to cover a lot of the same material. Thanks so much for listening to this segment of the episode. I'm going to turn this over to our other producer, Bridget Surdock. They're going to listen back and let me know and send me their notes on if I got anything wrong or if we need to add anything for clarification or confusion. So don't go away. Going to be right back. And we're back. All right, doing this one a day later, actually. Usually I try to do these the same day. However, got a little bit busy, and so a little bit late on this one, but no worries. I have my notes from producer Bridget Surdock, and here's what they had to say. They did preface by saying word count stuff, as we've talked about before. They're not Bridget's specialty, I guess, or they claim that they're less knowledgeable on. I personally think they are selling themselves short because Bridget, you read so many books. You know word counts. You know word. You're just humble. But Bridget did say, going solely on what OP said, it's kind of impossible to tell if the chapter is too long or not. I will say that for the first few chapters, that's sort of a litmus test for the reader on how the rest of the book is going to go. And a part of that is going to be chapter length. And yeah, real quick, I'd say that this is kind of what I was getting at with the Brandon Sanderson thing. He's been talking about this in his recent lectures. And yeah, when you start the novel a certain way, it tells the reader to expect things to continue on that way. And it's not a hard and fast rule. There are some books, there are some movies that will totally have a tilt shift of some form. There's another word for that I'm forgetting, but you get, yeah, like some kind of pivot that is going to change what kind of thing that you are watching. And it's hard to get away with this. It really is. But so that's why you want to really rely on letting your first few chapters really be that thesis statement for the movie. The example we've used before on the show, if you haven't listened to the previous episode where we talked about this, Raiders of the Lost Ark is a great example of this. The cold open of Indiana Jones is really just a microcosm of the entire movie. And that is on purpose because it shows you sort of what kind of movie you're in for. That Indy is going to go through some very specifically challenging things. He's going to get betrayed. He's actually not going to get the treasure, but he's going to make it out and survive the day, and so on and so on. So yeah, that pretty much covers it. Bridget said, I will say that for the first few chapters, oh, sorry, I read that part already. They said, if the first 5 chapters are all roughly the same length, the reader will expect that going forward and be more surprised at a long or short chapter. If the chapters bounce around in length, then you can normally get away with drastic changes in word count like OP describes. Which is not to say that if your first 5 or so chapters are all 3,000 words, you can't have a 6,000 word chapter later on, just that it'll be more of a surprise. Yeah, and I've definitely had that experience where I won't even notice really that a chapter is that long because ideally you're going to be so enraptured in the novel that you're going to be fine. And a lot of that is because your early chapters, maybe for example, are earning you a lot of credibility, right? That the reader is going to trust you because you have proven to them that you can write concisely and in a way that has hooked them. And so that's why for me, I typically don't mind starting with a longer chapter in the very beginning because most of the rest of the book isn't going to be filled with longer chapters, so I don't have to earn that credibility as much. So if that makes sense, so basically I start with a chapter that's a bit longer, but it's trying to be the microcosm of the entire novel. And then when they get to the next few chapters, they see, okay, the book moving forward is this kind of length. So within 5 chapters, I have sort of set up a specific cadence, which is that, all right, reader, you're going to get most of your chapters are going to be around 3 to 4,000 words. They're going to have usually 1 or 2, maybe 3 scenes. But once in a while, like if it's a really important chapter, you are going to get an extended one that's going to be a little special. And in this case, that was the first chapter. So that's me just trying to communicate to the reader, hey, this is what you're in for. Bridget wrote, also, OP's still just drafting at this point. What they've written thus far might be 7,000 words, but if they go back, they can always trim it down or find a way to break it up into several chapter or separate chapters or what have you. Yeah. So we talked about this. Excuse me. Yeah, we talked about this. 7,000. You can definitely bring that down to at least 5. And it's little things. We've talked about this. I think the word count episode, we talked about this, where there are little tricks you can do. You can clean up your contractions. So instead of saying I had, you can say, or not I had would be an example, but I would, you could say I'd, that kind of thing. You can take is and was out of your novel as much as you can and rewrite things to be a little bit punchier. You can take out phrases that, oh yeah, actually I don't need that. So that kind of thing. It just takes a little bit of editing, and that's what revisions are for. But that said, I do want to re-emphasize that if your chapter is 7,000 words, that is a sign that something could be wrong with it structurally. So just editing it for length might not be enough. That doesn't mean something is inherently wrong with it. It's just a sign. It's a red flag that this is really long. Maybe you need to investigate, why is this long? And is there something wrong with the way this chapter is set up structurally that's going to make it more difficult to read in a way that you don't, intend, right? Bridget wrote, I did a quick Googling on chapter lengths and found this article that's based on statistics of the bestsellers from 2021 to 2022. Yeah, so they share something from SarahNeofield.com, the average chapter. It's a relatively small sample size, but a good look at general trends in chapter lengths. The general conclusion is that novel lengths, chapter lengths, word count, and all that junk is kind of whatever. You can write short or long chapters and potentially get away with it. Keep in mind, these are best-selling novels written by some prolific authors and should not be seen as the rule. It's hard to say one way or another if a chapter is too long, but based on this article, even Stephen King, who is an outlier, had chapters around 5,400 words, not 7,000 like OP. So, just be critical of your own work. You can always write it out now and go back and see what can be cut or where a break can be added. So I like that, yeah, Bridget is coming at this with nuance. Bridget is saying, look, there's not always a hard and fast rule for these things, and it takes a little bit of experience, and you can factor in other authors to have an idea because you're going to read other books. So you're going to be able to use your inspirations to be like, all right, typically this is what readers would expect. And you can subvert that a little if you want, but you have to be careful with this sort of thing. You have to be like, well, I'm going to get away with that because George R. R. Martin got away with having 20 POV characters. Well, first of all, did he? Second of all, yeah, you have to remember that you're not that author. You don't have that credibility and trust of your readers in the same way that these more prolific ones do. So yeah, you're not necessarily going to get away with things. Think of it in the way that, if you look at J.K. Rowling, when Harry Potter was blowing up and everything, and, that first Harry Potter book was just it was short. It was really geared toward more middle grade kids and stuff like that. But as the books became more and more popular, Rowling was basically able to get away with making the books longer, darker, and a bit more convoluted, that sort of thing. And so, in my opinion, that's a big reason why I think those books get kind of terrible as they go on, but we don't have to get into my Harry Potter hot takes. I'm not a Harry Potter hater, just a J.K. Rowling hater. But anyway, so that should do it for today's episode of Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Sorry, this one's a little bit late, but we have plenty more to get to. I think we have so many listener comments and write-ins that we need to get to hopefully this week, so stay tuned here. And remember, if you do like the show, you've listened this far, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Love that we've been getting some more subscribers on the YouTube channel as well. Hoping to do more videos. And if you want to support us and just let us know that you like the show, writing in anytime just to say hey is always nice. I love reading these and sending them to Natalia and Bridget so they get to read them too. And of course, please let us know if there's anything we can do to make the show even better for you. If you have any ideas, suggestions, your own advice that you would like to write in, I think literally right before I started recording, we got something on the Discord that I want to get to right away. So all that said, have a great one and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.